Hello, and welcome to IMPAKT TV. I'm Andrej Kapor, and I'm talking today with Lena Chen, who is a feminist artist, writer, and activist whose work addresses issues of women's identity, trauma, and intimacy. Lena, would you like to tell us a little bit of an introduction to your background, how you ended up where you are now, and what your current practice involves?
So I'm a Chinese American artist who's also spent many years in Europe, primarily Berlin. And I started out doing performance work that was deeply participatory, as well as live. And obviously, a lot of that changed over the course of the pandemic, and also my graduate school studies, which coincided with the pandemic. And these days, I'm doing more work that is mediated through technology. A lot of it is still quite performative, and a lot of it investigates the intersections between sex work and technology in particular, with an emphasis on the ways in which censorship affects sex workers on social media, and how that also impacts artists who are dealing with content related to sexuality.
Great. So, could we take a little peek at your website and maybe get a taste of what you've been up to over the years?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so feel free to take us through any particular project here that you think might be of interest or that you'd like to talk about.
Where I have a GoPro strapped to my crotch. This was part of my one woman show that was produced in Berlin with Frederica Tsai, a Taiwanese dramaturg. And it was based on my experiences surviving revenge porn. I ended up creating a show that involved reflecting the audience's gaze back at them. And over the course of telling this story, the performance becomes more and more confrontational until I actually end up in the area where the audience is actually sitting. And part of this experience that I examine, it was not just about the violation of having intimate photos of myself published without my consent. It was also about the fact that there was public dissemination that a large number of people took part in. And so I saw revenge porn as not just being something that was the responsibility of the single person doing the publication of the images, but something that society at large was complicit in.
So, has the experience of working with trauma survivors and sex workers and abortion workers on social practice projects changed your view of the world? And is there a related project to this that you might have in mind for the future?
Yeah, I mean, we can go through my website again, maybe. Most recent project.
This one?
No, it's the one below it.
Ah, yes.
So OnlyFans is a work that directly tackles the issue of social media censorship and digital discrimination against sex workers. It's set up as a digital game where you play the role of a sex worker who's trying to establish an online fan base, and make money through posting erotic content. And over the course of creating the work, we relied primarily on research from a coalition of sex workers and technologists called Hacking Hustling, as well as on real stories, real pictures that sex workers submitted, which were actually flagged and taken off of platforms like Instagram. So you get to know the conditions under which people are trying to make a living online and encountering various means of surveillance, various hurdles from having their accounts shadow banned, meaning that it's impossible to find them through any organic way, to having their accounts outright deleted. And more recently, in the past year, MasterCard and other payment processors have refused to process transactions that are related to adult content. And this is also something that has really impacted independent sex workers and erotic content producers in particular. So, although it's an issue that seems to be primarily affecting this community, many of the technologies that are being used are also being used against community organizers, journalists. So, the impact on our experience of the internet is actually quite widespread, and it affects how all of us experience the web, what all of us can say or do. So the game is a way to educate people in a hopefully entertaining and aesthetically pleasing manner about these issues. And also to create some empathy by showing these are the real stories, the real people who are being affected. And most of them are folks who occupy multiple marginalized identities. Those are the communities most vulnerable to actually being censored online.
Okay. Yeah, I've tried it out. It was a tough game. But then again, I'm not much of a gamer, so but and of course, oftentimes, especially what you mentioned with the payment processing and stuff, it seems another example where these various forms of oppression are being tested on marginalized groups before they might be applied elsewhere or across the board. I'm not sure if you would agree.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
what threats are women likely to receive in trying to take ownership and control of their bodies and the image thereof, and what can we do as both practitioners but also participants in the media landscape to change the situation?
I mean, I have to be honest. I think that, what one individual person can do is quite limited. But I think because a lot of these policies are being created by actually American lawmakers, a lot of the advocacy efforts thus far have been very, very much based in America. Through American civil liberty groups and so forth. But the actual consequences are experienced by people worldwide because, of course, if Twitter, an American company, instates a certain policy, that affects all Twitter users, no matter where they're based, right? So I think it's particularly important for folks to educate themselves about what the actual threats are, and to realize that the type of monitoring that happens of accounts like the ones belonging to sex workers could also happen to them. I've known artists, for example, who have lost access to their accounts, and it's because they're posting content that is viewed as some kind of sexual advertisement, right? And sex workers, despite following content guidelines very closely because they know they're at risk, might still be flagged no matter how hard they try. So I see a lot of alignment actually between different groups who have a mutual interest in preserving freedom of expression on the internet. And I think it's a matter of working together in coalitions in order to advocate for ourselves.
So do you have any examples from your own practice or your colleagues or something that you've recently witnessed that you might be able to share with us?
Yeah, I would say that one of the more successful approaches was taken actually by the Tourism Board of Vienna, because there were several large art institutions in Austria that experienced censorship of their artworks when they tried to post them to Instagram or Facebook. So, in response, they created a PR campaign where they actually began an OnlyFans account where you could view these artworks that were too explicit for social media. And I thought that was a really wonderful way to bring attention to a serious issue while, obviously also promoting Austrian art, but demonstrating, more importantly, the allegiances and shared interests that artists and sex workers have with one another.
So it's a subversive engagement with the system. Interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's showing how ridiculous these policies are and how poorly enforced they are.
Okay, so I have one more very short question for you. Because your work deals so much with intimacy and also your own personal experiences, and including the work that you showed us on your website a moment ago, what do you do to maintain some sense of intimacy and privacy separate to your work?
That's really hard, actually. I mean, for one, a lot of my practice these days is much less autobiographical than it was in the past. I'm dealing less with my particular trauma, and though certainly there are things I draw from my lived experience, being someone who has worked in the sex industry, who has faced censorship as both a sex worker and artist. I think that my experience in making artwork has changed now that I bring in the stories of other people and work in a very collaborative format. And I think that's also just, it's a matter of being someone who has worked in a socially engaged way in many years and understanding that there are certain boundaries I have to erect. And if I'm in this for the long haul, just like, in community organizing or in mental health, the people who work in those fields, they have to realize that oftentimes progress is one step forward, two steps back, and you try to make what impact you can. But yeah, this is hard work, and it's going to be a marathon, not a sprint. So sometimes at the end of the day, you just have to shut off your computer and be pleased with whatever you accomplished and move on.
Well, thank you very much. I believe our time is up here, but it's been wonderful talking to you. Thanks for sharing your work and your thoughts, and hope to see more of your work and yourself in the future.
Thank you.